As many of you know, recently we did a study class on the question of whether or not the Bible is true when considered and compared against modern conclusions in archaeology and history. The moderns would clearly conclude that the Bible is not true. It's not historically reliable. The purpose of our study class was to show that as we consider the findings in archaeology, there is more proof in archaeology today that the Bible is true and that the events described in the Bible did happen than that they didn't. Now, our class showed that there was far more interest in this subject than I would have supposed. So I will try and reproduce, hopefully in a more organized fashion, some of that study here. Principally, what we challenge is the chronology of the world's events as determined by conventional archaeology. Chronology is the arrangement of the order of events and the times in which they occurred. Chronology is said to be the pillar upon which history, and to a large degree archaeology, is hung. And those are the kinds of things we plan to discuss in these lectures. This particular lecture will be limited to just the overall timeline of the Bible, so that in future lectures we can see how the timeline of the Bible compares with what the world has come up with. Now, we've all seen the terrible tragedy of the murder of the young man Charlie Kirk, who inspired a number of young people to look into the Bible. And Charlie kept encouraging them to read the Bible and to go to church. As he did so, I always thought, what are all those young people going to think when they go to those churches and find out that so many of the preachers and the religionists in those churches don't believe that the events of the Old Testament actually happened? Modern scholars, for the most part, think the Old Testament, and some even think the New Testament, are all just myths and legends, all just moral stories, how to live a good life. It is referred to by many of these religionists as the history that never happened. And there are certain reasons specifically why they don't believe these events happened. So we will go over some of those reasons in the course of this discussion. But a lot of the reason why the Bible is considered to be just good stories and fables has to do with modern day chronology and history and archaeology. Now, there are 4 different chronologies that we will be discussing, and I'll identify them this way. The first chronology, the first one, we will call biblical chronology, and that's the one we will deal principally with this evening. Biblical chronology is sometimes called by the people who discuss these things in the world as Bible priority chronology, because we believe the Bible is an accurate historical document, and where other chronologies might differ from the Bible, those chronologies have either been misunderstood or misapplied. The Bible is the inspired Word of God, and therefore it supersedes any human interpretation of past events. Now, as you can imagine, this is not the method used by any of the other chronologies. The other chronologies that we'll discuss, generally speaking, disregard the Bible as a reliable historical and chronological record. Even the Christian chronologists, who generally believe that the events of the Bible did happen, don't have them in the place where the Bible says they did occur. Now, the second chronology that we will look at is the conventional one, and it is based on how the world's learned men, whom the scriptures call the wisdom of this world, which God says is foolishness with him, and who claim to be completely detached from the Bible, how they view history and archaeology. This is the chronology that you're most likely to see in your school books, or in commentaries on television, or on your YouTube videos. Now, there is a third chronology that we'll look at, a third class of men, which we will call Christian archaeologists. And though that's only probably about 1/10 of 1% of all the archaeologists working. And they do a much better job than the conventional group because they believe that the events actually occurred. But rather than try to fit the scriptural events into a specific scriptural time frame, we'll look at the events that happened and try and match them to conventional chronology. A good argument they use, the Christian archaeologists, is that if we looked for evidence in World War II in the year 2020, we would find none. If we looked to try and find out when World War II happened, and we looked for evidence of it in 2020, we would find no evidence that it ever happened. Of course, that doesn't happen because World War II happened in the 1930s and 1940s. So if we were looking for it in 2020, it doesn't mean that it never happened. It just means that it didn't happen then. So likewise, when you look for Bible events in the wrong time frame of history, you won't find them. But that doesn't mean that they didn't exist. And it doesn't mean that you wouldn't find evidence for them if you looked in the proper time frame. Now, the fourth chronology that we'll discuss is called revisionist chronology. A recent revisionist chronology developed by an archaeologist named David Rohl has, in my opinion, added greatly to the discussion of Bible chronology, particularly as regards the Old Testament. In my opinion, there needs to be another person like David Rohl who can harmonize the many flaws in the Assyrian chronologies and present them in an organized manner, as Rohl has done with the Egyptian chronologies, to bring the Assyrian chronologies into harmony with the Bible, as Rohl's work has done with the Egyptians. So with those parameters, let's jump into our subject. Chronology, as we said, is the pillar upon which history is hung. Now, what does that mean? It means that we must find some event in history that we can tie to a specific year on our Gregorian calendar. That year then becomes the pillar upon which we can base all the other events of history. You see, in antiquity, they did not use dates like BC or AD. They dated things according to the year of a king. So the chronologist must figure out how to adjust, say, the 11th year of Zedekiah to a specific date on our calendar. And that date would then be the foundation upon which all the other dates would be established. These pillars, as chronologists call them, are thought to be sound and generally unquestionable dates. And if the pillars chosen are truly unquestionably correct, then the chronologies that they develop will also be correct. But if these pillars are wrong, then all the dates based upon those pillars will be wrong. And frankly, there are not many good pillars in antiquity. For instance, conventional chronologists base Assyrian chronologies on an eclipse, which is called the Ber Sagale, literally the bending of the sun. This is thought to be an eclipse that took place in 763 BC. Egyptian chronology is based on things like the rising of Sothis, which is the appearance of a bright star in July, signaling a time for planting after the receding of the Nile River, after it floods. These astronomical events of the sun and the stars are naturally repeated over time. So choosing which eclipse or which Sothis in your time frame you're referring to affects how the chronology is established and allows for error. Now, I'll start by setting out the Bible chronology, which I have developed using only the Bible. I suppose the learned chronologists, as we said, would call it Bible priority, and that we assume the Bible is completely accurate as an historical document, and therefore its dates take precedent over all the other chronologies offered. This chronology is made with an effort to not ignore any of the Bible records or prophecies which are given, and to include and harmonize them all. This chronology has several goals in mind. First and foremost, it's an effort to show that all the Bible is historically true in the face of archaeologists and historians, and sadly today, many pastors and rabbis who would argue against it. Secondly, it's to explore the prophecy of creation. God created the world as we have it in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So will the sons of men be given rule of the earth for 6,000 years, and Jesus will rule the world in peace in that 7,000th period, the seventh millennium. We will explore where we are in that timetable. And lastly, I suppose it is to show through Bible prophecy that deity is and has been working out his plan of salvation in the earth. Now, as we have pointed out, it's fundamental to chronologists to have some starting point, some pillar to which they can fix a date in antiquity to our modern calendar. As we said, in antiquity they didn't have AD or BC. They tended to date things according to the rule of a specific king. They also dated things according to natural events, like an eclipse or a star being in a certain location, or an earthquake. And as we said, all these things are quite subjective. Eclipses and stars repeat themselves with a certain frequency. Full eclipses may only repeat every 300 or 400 years, while partial eclipses occur far more frequently. So it's unreliable at best to base history on these events. From the world's perspective, the first unquestioned pillar is when the Assyria under King Ashurbanipal sacked the Egyptian capital of Thebes in 664 BC. And you can see that going back in antiquity, that's not going back very far, 600 years before Christ. At this historical point, you have two great ancient civilizations coming together to record a main event. That is all well and good, but Ashurbanipal doesn't occur in the scriptures. So this does nothing for our chronology. The first great pillar of our chronology is the sacking of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians in 587 BC. The 587 BC date for this year is consistent with the chronologies of Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt. In 2 Kings 25 and 3 and 5, we read of it. It says, "And the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah." You see, that's the time when the temple was destroyed. It says, "The city was broken up, and all the men of war fled." Here in this event, we have the involvement of 4 civilizations of antiquity. The Babylonians, the Jews are fighting the battle at Jerusalem, and they're fighting a few years after the defeat of the Egyptians and their allies, the Assyrians, at the great battle of Carchemish. So this gives us a very firm date, 587 BC. From here, we can establish scriptural pillars. The first, as we said, is the fall of the temple in 587 BC. From the prophecy of Ezekiel, we can establish the amount of time that the temple existed. From the prophecy, we can clearly show that it was 430 years from the fall of the temple in 587 BC to the year that the foundation of the temple was laid, which was in the 4th year of Solomon. Ezekiel 4 through 8 defines the 430 years of the temple's existence from the foundation of the 4th of Solomon, which would be 1016. That's simply a math question, subtracting 430 years from the 587 BC. So that takes us back to Solomon's reign. Next, in 1 Kings 6:1, it defines 480 years from the foundation of the temple back to the Exodus. 1 Kings tells us that from the laying of the foundation to the night of the Exodus was exactly 480 years. From this testimony, we can conclude that the Exodus took place in 1495 BC. So 1495 BC, the year of the Exodus, becomes our third pillar. And you can see now some of the problems with these pillars. We said that the first good pillar for the world is the victory of Ashurbanipal over Thebes in Egypt. And that's at 664 BC. Well, now we're back to 1495 BC, 800 years earlier. And there are no pillars that we can grasp onto. The only true pillar we can grasp onto, of course, is the Scriptures. And lastly, we learn from the Apostle Paul that Abraham received the promise 430 years before the giving of the law. And we know that the giving of the law from Exodus 19, verses 1 and 2, was in the third month of the same year as the Exodus. So the giving of the law was in 1495. And Paul tells us that the promise made to Abraham was 430 years before the law. So we can conclude that Abraham received the promise in 1924 BC, which is our fourth pillar. Now, as we shall eventually show, using another scriptural testimony, we can establish that Abraham was 30 years old when he received the promise. So he began wandering in the same year that he received the promise. And that was at age 30. So that gives us our fourth pillar of 1924 BC, when Abraham was 30. And from there, we can establish a full chronology all the way of the patriarchs, the full chronology of the patriarchs, all the way back to Adam, which takes us to creation. By following the chronology of the patriarchs, we can see that the world was created in 3884 BC. And if we add 6,000 years to that, we get 2117 AD. So we can see that we are still within God's 7,000-year plan for mankind. 2117 would not be the date for Christ's return. It would be the year that the millennium reign of Christ would begin after all the necessary wars that the world calls Armageddon. And we will ultimately go into these things, showing that the time frame for those events necessary to occur after Christ's return and before the millennium could be as much as 90 years, so that the return of Christ is now upon us. Let's now examine these four pillars of the Bible in detail. So beginning here at Ezekiel 4, verses 4 through 8, we see the prophecy that Ezekiel gives us. This is when Ezekiel is getting a prophecy concerning the destruction of the temple. And in the destruction of the temple, Ezekiel is told, was to be demonstrated by him lying on his left side and on his right side. We read there, "Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it, thou shalt bear their iniquity. For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days. And 90 days, so shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel." So there's 390 days lying on his left side. "And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. Therefore thou shalt set thy face toward the siege of Jerusalem, and thine arm shall be uncovered, and thou shalt prophesy against it. And behold, I will lay bands upon thee, and thou shalt not turn thee from one side to another, till thou hast ended the days of thy siege." Now, when we get to this point in history for the destruction of the temple, remember the date we're talking about is 587 BC. 587 BC for the date of the destruction of the temple, minus, that should be 430, minus 430 is 1017 or 1016, the way archaeology is counted. The fourth of Solomon then takes place in 1016. Now, when we look at the prophecy by Ezekiel, it should be pretty simple. Let's consider the 390 and the 40 days differences of laying on his side. When we consider the number of the years the scripture gives us for the kings of Israel, from the laying of the foundation of the temple to the 4th of Solomon, to the destruction of the temple in the 11th of Zedekiah, we have exactly 430 years. When we start with Solomon, we see that there was 40 years of time from the laying of the foundation of the temple in the 4th of Solomon to the rebellion of Rehoboam 40 years later in the 4th of Rehoboam. We read of Rehoboam's rebellion. We read, so they strengthened the kingdom of Judah. This is after the death of Solomon. So they strengthened the kingdom of Judah and made Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, strong 3 years. For 3 years they walked in the way of David and Solomon. So there we have the laying on the right side for 40 years, from the 4th of Solomon through the 3rd year of Rehoboam. But then came the rebellion, and it came to pass when Rehoboam had established the kingdom and had strengthened himself, he forsook the law of the Lord and all Israel with him. So there is the 40 years of Ezekiel laying on his right side. The time when Israel walked in the way of David and Solomon was 40 years. Rehoboam ended that, and then following rebellion, Shishak comes against him, punishing him for his rebellion in the 5th year. We read there, and it came to pass in the 5th year of Rehoboam, the Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He even took away all, and he took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. So since Solomon reigned for 40 years, the 4th of Rehoboam would make it 40 years after the 4th of Solomon. And you can see here from 1016 to 976 BC that this represented this time period. The establishment of the temple, the foundation of the temple in 1016, the 4th year of Rehoboam, 976, and that would be the time that Ezekiel was lying on his right side. He says, lay on your right side for 40 years. That's the 40 years of Solomon to the 4th of Rehoboam. Now we know in the 4th year of Rehoboam there was a rebellion, and Rehoboam rebelled against the divine principles. And then there are another 390 years of corrupted temple keeping. So there's a rebellion that takes place 40 years into the life of the temple, and that's represented in this prophecy by Ezekiel. And then we go to another 390 years of the kings of Judah in rebellion, and that's 430 years total till the temple's destruction. Now that seems pretty simple, doesn't it? We should be able to count from the destruction of the temple to the 4th of Solomon. Now the 4th of Solomon is the second most important pillar that we have, because it's a key verse in determining the Exodus in the chronology of Israel. The 4th of Solomon is important because when we get to Kings, it says, and it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon, or Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So we can now determine that from the destruction of the temple in the 11th of Zedekiah to the day they came out of Israel, we have a period of 430 years plus 480 years. This takes us back to the Exodus and gives us the precise year in which the Exodus occurred. It gives us the real precise time. And what date would that be? It would be 1495 BC, or at the start, very start of the 15th century. That's shown in that equation. We then go on. The question becomes, can we date it back further? Can we date the Bible, that is, back further? Because really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to establish whether or not we're still within the 6,000 years of the kingdoms of men. We know that God created the earth in 6 days, and rested on the seventh. Now, we've always looked at that as a type of the kingdoms of men, which would run for 6,000 years, and then the 7,000th year would be the millennium. So the question is, are we still in those 6,000 years? Now, if you follow either the world's chronologists or the Christian chronologists, they must answer no to this question, for their chronologies go way past the 6,000 years in both of their chronologies. We look at the next prophecy we have, because we've now taken it back to the Exodus, right? We have the point of the Exodus, but we have to go back further. So how do we do it? So here's how we do it. We know that when we start to read the Bible in Genesis 5 and in Genesis 11, when we are starting with the children of men, we get a very clear list of the scriptures. All of these people here that we have shows us and tells us how old they were when they had their next child, and then how old that child was when he had his next child. And it gives us a very consistent timeline that we can follow all the way down to Joseph. We have that timeline that takes us all the way down to where Jacob begets Joseph. But then once Joseph goes into Egypt, we no longer have a lineage that we can follow. We are not told how old Joseph was when he had Manasseh, his firstborn. And we're told nothing about how old Manasseh was with his firstborn. So there's no way to follow and decide how long it was from when they went into Egypt to the Exodus. That's an undetermined point. So we have to find a scriptural way that we can cross that period of time. Now, the way we cross that scripturally is by two verses that we've been given. One in Exodus, where we read in Exodus 12, verse 40 and 41, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." So there's 430 years from the beginning of the sojourning of Israel to the Exodus. And that's the beginning of the sojourning under Abraham. Well, if we had just had that verse, it really wouldn't tell us very much, would it? It wouldn't tell us when the sojourning began, for instance, or any of those kinds of things. But the Apostle Paul gives us the key to figuring this out. He says in Galatians 3:17, "And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect." So this tells us that the law is given in the same year of the Exodus, right? The Exodus takes place in the first month, takes place on the 14th day of the first month. The law is given on the third month of that same year. So both of these events, the giving of the promise to Abraham and the start of his sojourning, are 430 years before the Exodus. So the promises made to Abraham to the giving of the law was the same 430 years as the start of their sojourning. All of that happened in the same year. So there's another verse which we must consider and which helps us figure all this out. It says in Genesis 15 at verse 13 and 16, "And he said unto Abraham, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." This is the verse that nearly all chronologists like to ignore. This is the one that can't possibly fit the way they look at things. Most Christian archaeologists that you will hear believe that Israel was in Egypt the entire 430 years of the prophecy of Exodus 12. Well, if Israel was in Egypt 430 years, then it's not possible for Abraham's seed to fulfill the prophecy that they would wander only 400 years. There's no way that that can be made to make any sense. Also, if they're in Egypt for 480 years, how do they come out in the fourth generation? What's the fourth generation? Can a generation be 120 years? No. It's got to be about 40 years, or 4 times 40 for a stay in Egypt of around 160 years, not 430. Now, Genesis 15 says that Abraham's seed is a stranger in the land that is not theirs for 400 years. When do they go into a land that is theirs? Here's what God says about it. In Exodus 6, starting at verse 6, we read, "Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. And I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God, and ye shall know that I am the Lord your God, which bringeth you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into a land concerning which I did swear to give it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it you for an heritage. I am the Lord." Does Israel then stop wandering in a strange land when they come into the land which God has given them? Is it not when Joshua enters the Holy Land in the 41st year, leaving Egypt, that they come into their own land and they stop wandering? That is when God says he gives the land to Israel. So let's consider the dates. If Exodus was 1495 BC, then the children of Israel had to arrive in their land of Canaan in 1454 BC, or in the 40th year after the Exodus, which had been in 1495. So if Abraham's seed wandering ends in 1454, it had to begin 400 years earlier, which would have been 1854. Abraham's seed, obviously, can't begin wandering until Abraham has seed, and his seed was Isaac. That tells us that 400 years before Israel entered into the land to take possession of it, Isaac was born. Working backwards then, Isaac was born 1454 plus 400 years, or in 1854 BC. Now we know that Abraham was 100 years old when he has Isaac. If Abraham was 100 years old when he had Isaac in 1854 BC, then Abraham had to have been born in 1954 BC, as we see here. Now, we have already seen that Abraham's sojourning began 430 years before the Exodus, or in 1924 BC. Abraham was born 1954 and begins his journey in 1924. So Abraham is 30 years old and living in Ur of the Chaldees when his wanderings begin. Calculating these dates this way, all the prophecies of the scriptural testimony agree. Now, Abraham, being 30 years old when he received the promises to start his calling, is not stated in the scriptures, but it is a common age for the start of something significant. Joseph stands before Pharaoh at age 30. David takes the kingdom also at age 30. Solomon also takes his kingdom at age 30. And Jesus begins his ministry at age 30. So 30 is a very important time, even though the scriptures doesn't say Abraham received the promises in his 30 years. Working the mathematics of the prophecies we've been given, we can see that he did. Now that we can put a date on Abraham at age 30, we can tie these three prophecies, the 430 from the destruction of the temple to the laying of the foundation of the temple, the 480 from the laying of the foundation of the temple to the Exodus, the 430 years from the Exodus to the 30th year of Abraham. We can now connect him to the genealogy of the patriarchs to determine the date for creation. And that date, as we said before, is 3884 BC. So as we said, where are we in God's plan? Well, 338.84 BC plus 6,000 years would be 2116. But adding a year for the fact that there's no zero, it means the millennial rule of Christ begins in 2117. Again, does that mean that we are today 90 years away from the return of Christ? Not at all. There are many, many events which must take place between the time that Christ returns and the time that he sets up the kingdom. The Christ's return must come and the judgment must follow. The destruction of the nations leading Christ up to Jerusalem and the victories he has there at Jerusalem must follow. The great wars in Europe following that must also take place. So there are a number of events that must take place before Christ can rule the world in peace for 1,000 years. In my opinion, this is what was happening to Abraham during the Ur of the Chaldees. I know all your maps are going to show the Ur of the Chaldees being in southern Iraq, just above the Persian Gulf. If you watch your YouTube videos, they will show you the great ziggurats of ancient Ur, just north of the Persian Gulf. Critics of the Bible, though, say that archaeology proves that there were no Chaldees in Ur at that time. Now, as we said before, this doesn't necessarily mean anything, as a cautionary refrain in archaeology is that the absence of proof is not proof of absence. Just because archaeologists have found no proof of Chaldeans in the southern Mesopotamia at that time doesn't mean that there weren't. So little of the land has actually been explored. But in this case, this Ur is likely that the archaeologists are correct, and the Christians anxious to find things that prove the Bible true have reached a false conclusion. Archaeology says that the Chaldeans were not in Ur at this time. Assyriologists, those who study Assyria, also say that the Chaldeans were in Syria at this time. They would call them Aramites, and they were further up northwest of Assyria. But that they were moving south, the Chaldeans were. And while the historians would not admit this, all the nations of the earth were moving south out of that region into Assyria, repopulating the earth from Mount Ararat after the flood. But the Chaldeans hadn't migrated down to southeast Iraq, the town that they named Ur, during the time frame of Abraham. They do get there, of course, about 1,000 years later. And by the time the Assyrian Empire is on the rise, they are there for sure. But they were probably not there at the call of Abraham. So where is the Ur where Abraham was born? Now, in the 19th century, before the archaeologists had discovered Ur in southern Iraq, before that Ur was archaeologically discovered in 1853, the common idea was that Abraham came either from a town called Ur-Kesh in northern Syria, or from one of its neighboring cities, which you can see near the center of this map. When Abraham left Ur-Kesh for Padan Aram, he was not going almost to Afghanistan, as the current beliefs are, but he was going up to that town of Edessa, there towards the top of your map. This is what most Bible scholars thought in the early 19th century. And a lot of things that they thought in the early 19th century, I believe, are more accurate than what the moderns have come up with. But if we consider the life of Noah, we see that it overlaps with the life of Abraham. After Abraham begins his sojourning, his life overlaps with the life of Noah for about 40 years. Now, the scriptures do not say that God sent Abraham to Padan Aram to learn the truth from Noah. That is a pretty unescapable conclusion. Especially is that the case when we consider Abraham's respect for Melchizedek, whom many believe to have been Shem, Noah's son. But Abraham is called at age 30, and he goes up to Padan Aram, God sending him up there to learn the truth from Noah and to learn the divine plan directly from Noah, because that's where Mount Ararat is, right north of Padan Aram, ancient Padan Aram, or Edessa. It's where and in Mount Ararat is where Noah landed the ark and where the world's population was going forth from. So Abraham is up there for 45 years, 40 years of which he shares with Noah. On this we see that this is the birth of Abraham. This would be the death of Noah. Abraham is 70 years old. 5 years later, Abraham leaves Haran for Canaan to go into the Holy Land. After the death of Noah, Abraham is now 75 years old and thoroughly prepared to walk faithfully in the Lord. Abraham leaves Padan Aram for the promised land of Canaan, which we know he wandered in. And he did not receive it as he was promised, God showing that the promises will be fulfilled when his seed, Jesus the Christ, returns to claim it for him, for Abraham, and for all who live faithfully in Christ. Thank you for your attention.